This podcast is brought to you by the Albany Public Library main branch and the generosity of listeners like you. What is a podcast? God, Daddy, these people talk as much as you do. Razib Khan's Unsupervised Learning.
The full audio of this monologue has not been uploaded. To hear the rest of the monologue, please go to razib.substack.com. Again, that's razib.substack.com. Thanks for listening to the ungated version of the Unsupervised Learning podcast. If you want to read some essays on some of these topics, please check out razib.substack.com. Again, that's razib.substack.com. Thank you. Hey everybody, welcome to this episode of Razib Khan's Unsupervised Learning podcast. And today I'm going to be talking about the genetic history, really, of Anatolia between 10,000 BC and basically 1500 AD. I'm going to go to the Turks. So I'll start with the Neolithic and go to the Turks. Actually start a little bit before the Neolithic. And it's going to be a lot of history, some archaeology. I don't know too much archaeology off the top of my head, but I know some. And, genetics. Thanks to a bunch of recent papers that came out of the Reich Lab and also other stuff that's been published on Turkey and Anatolia over the last 10 years or so. There's a lot we know, a lot I can say, so that's what I'm going to try to do here. So, first, we're going to go with a periodization and a chronology, so I'm not going to really deviate too much from the chronology. So we'll start at the Neolithic. We'll actually start at the end of the Paleolithic. I think they call it Epipaleolithic or Mesolithic, depending on where you are, right after the Ice Age. So the last Ice Age ends 11,700 years ago. And so people are still hunter-gatherers for, 1,000 years, maybe a little less. The earliest agriculture might be 11,000 BC. It might be 11,000 BC, maybe a little after. So there's this period after the Ice Age. It's the Holocene. It's warmed up. It's nice and fertile and verdant, and it is still hunter-gatherer time, forager time, right? Still some weird stuff is happening in the world that we just know about now. So the standard model for the emergence of agriculture was that, people settled down because they had agriculture. They discovered agriculture. It was such a superior, way of life, et cetera, et cetera. And they had experimented with, semi-domestication earlier. What has happened in the last couple of decades is things are in flux. The short of it is it may be that agriculture emerged as a response to settled and sedentary lifestyle. So that means that there were hunter-gatherer groups that started settling down into proto-villages before they had agriculture, and agriculture was a way that they could support their populations without being nomadic all the time. And larger populations, agriculture is about, rule of thumb, I think it's about like 10 times more productive per unit acre for calorie-wise than foraging. And so you can support a much larger population. But even before agriculture, there are things that are out there that look like they're by sedentary peoples, large numbers of people. So the Near East, especially southern Anatolia, northern Syria, the foothills, of northern Mesopotamia, of northern Iraq, the Levant, the Fertile Crescent, all these areas. A lot of them were actually like pretty warm and moist for a little while right after the end of the Ice Age. So really, really high primary productivity, maybe higher than today, probably higher than today, definitely higher than the Ice Age. And so, these foragers, these hunter-gatherers in the area had a bonanza temporarily. And there's a site called Göbekli Tepe. I think I'm not pronouncing it correctly because it's in Turkish. It's in the south. It's on the southeastern edge of Turkey, on the edge of the plateau, kind of overlooking, Mesopotamia, but not in Mesopotamia. It's in Anatolia. And so this site is pretty cool. If you Google it, you will see that it's got these monumental pillars, limestone pillars. I think they're like 16 enclosures and like 8 pillars per enclosure. And the pillars themselves and a lot of the stonework, they have very, very detailed depictions of animals. And they have some depictions of humans, but often they're headless. So that's weird. There's a lot of vultures being depicted and also a lot of the animals that they hunted. So this work on this site started in 11,500 BC. This is before agriculture, okay, as we understand it. There is no agriculture at this time. So these people are foragers, they're hunter-gatherers. Turns out they're gazelle hunters. And they're creating this monumental megalithic architecture. And these are the first real megaliths that we have any evidence of. And so megalith is like Stonehenge. Stonehenge is megalith. Like, this is serious stuff. And it's Göbekli Tepe is not the only one. There's some other sites nearby and also further east. So it seems like a part of the cultural tradition of this region. And when in the 60s archaeologists first stumbled onto the site, they assumed it was Byzantine. So they assumed like 500 AD, right? So they assumed it was 12,000 years later than it was. And the reason they assumed that is it just looks too well done. It's too complicated. It's too fine. It's too quote unquote civilized. So I'm bringing this up for two reasons. One, we are reconsidering some of the truths that we've held about kind of like the progress of civilization and kind of the arc of ascending up the ladder of complexity, right? It looks like some of these hunter-gatherers were doing really, really complex things, probably because they were not small, isolated, scattered tribes like the Khoisan Bushmen, but there were large groups of people that were living off extremely productive territory. Now, that territory in the historical epic has always been occupied by farmers because they like productive territory, right? But their ancestors who were there, potentially, were benefiting from it as foragers, as hunter-gatherers. So who are these people? So I haven't said anything about Anatolia yet, and I should probably define it, because these were on the southeastern edge of Anatolia. They were Anatolians, in all likelihood, and that's going to mean a lot more genetically in a little while. But let's talk about the geography. Most of you know what Anatolia is, also called Asia Minor, westernmost peninsula in Asia, the continent of Asia. The term Asia actually comes from Arzawa, I think, or Aswa, the westernmost area of Anatolia during the Bronze Age. It's in the Hittite records, right? And so that became all of Asia eventually, just etymological detail. So Anatolia, obviously Black Sea north, Mediterranean, Aegean on the west, and then on the south there's the Mediterranean going towards Cyprus. But the southern and southeastern edge of Anatolia is a little bit more difficult to pin, right? If you look at modern Turkey, that is basically the expansive definition of Anatolia. It's basically the highlands north of the Fertile Crescent and somewhere to the west of what is now western Iran. Definitely west of the Zagros Mountains. But this is an expanded definition. Some people exclude much of what used to be the old Armenian highlands in eastern Turkey and parts of Kurdistan from Anatolia. So you could say Anatolia is the north, the center, the west, the southwest, and maybe part of the center east. But the far east and the southeast of Turkey is not Anatolia, possibly. I don't go with that definition because it seems a little arbitrary to me. I think I am going to go with basically all of Turkey, the whole plateau area, and kind of arbitrarily just cut it off in the middle of the Armenian highlands. Because the Armenian highlands really push a little east into Iran, they push north, and then a lot of them are in what is today eastern Turkey. Obviously, because of the Armenian genocide in the early 20th century, there are no Armenians that live there anymore, but there used to be Armenians that live there, right? So they are the eastern Armenian highlands. So Mount Ararat in the east of Turkey on the border with Iran, or maybe Armenia, check the geography there. But let's define that as kind of the easternmost. And then everything, most of southern Turkey, I'm counting as Anatolia. There's a little region that pushes southward along the Mediterranean coast, and that's pretty much Syria. But all the other stuff I'm counting as Anatolia, right, geographically. So these people are in, Göbekli Tepe is a site in southern Turkey. It's about a week's walk. I actually checked it. A week's walk east of Cilicia, for those who know what that is. It's a week's walk east of the city of Tarsus, where Saul of Tarsus was born, later to be called St. Paul. So who are these people? Why were they important? I mean, I think they're a big deal just because this is the first monumental architecture, which would recur, actually, in human societies across the world, but especially in Europe during the Neolithic, and I'm going to get into that. But they were not the first farmers, probably. The first farmers were probably descendants of people called the Natufians. The Natufian culture extends from the Negev north into, say, the border with the upper Euphrates River. So it's basically, into what used to be the Islamic State in eastern Syria. And it looks like the Natufians are the first agriculturalists, the first grain cultivators, so wheat, barley, these sorts of things, probably in the foothills of the Eastern Mediterranean, what is really greater Syria. And they probably started doing this, let's say like 11,000 BC or maybe a little bit later, 10,000 BC, that area, right? 1,000 or 2 years after the Ice Age ended. And like the people of Göbekli Tepe, the Anatolian farmers, they were foragers before. They were hunting gazelle and other wild game like that. But soon after this, development of agriculture, the practice spread north, it spread east. It really, really kind of took over the Middle East, the Near East, really quickly. And you have something called the pre-pottery Neolithic. There's no pottery, but there's for several thousand years there's agriculture. So what and I'm not an expert in this. When I looked at the literature, it wasn't clear actually from the perspective of archaeologists whether this was the spread of Natufians or whether there were independent cultural adaptations or adoptions, I would say. And the people in the Zagros Mountains in modern day Kurdistan, basically in western Iran, it looks like they actually might have domesticated sheep first, earlier than Natufians, and that practice spread westward, obviously. And it could be that in the Taurus Mountains and in southeastern Anatolia, that might be the first area that actually domesticated cattle occur. So, I mean, obviously, cattle are more of a woodland forest creature, I think. Open pastures. And so, there's much more of that in Anatolia at the time than there is in Syria or modern day Israel, that area, or Mesopotamia. So even though the first farmers are Natufian, almost certainly, there were other things happening elsewhere. Now, were these descendants of people that had spread out of the Natufian zone and brought agriculture? Well, we now know that's not true. So ancient DNA, I think Yosef Lazaridis has a paper from 2016, three major groups of farmers. Basically, what ancient DNA is showing is the farmers of Anatolia were very genetically distinct from the farmers of Syria. Farmers of Syria descend from the Natufians. The farmers of Anatolia descend from Anatolian foragers. So probably the type of people that constructed Göbekli Tepe. The farmers of the Zagros Mountains, western Iran, are quite different. And genetically, they're very similar to the people in the Caucasus. Perhaps they are part of a clan with the Caucasus hunter-gatherers, or perhaps they're descended from Caucasus hunter-gatherers, or perhaps Caucasus hunter-gatherers are descended from people in western Iran and the Zagros. Whatever it is, often their genetic component is similar to Caucasus hunter-gatherers, CHG. It's called CHG often, but sometimes I call them Eastern farmers, and I think that's what I'm going to do. Those people are genetically very distinct from Anatolians and Syrians, who themselves are distinct from each other. But if you look at a phylogenetic tree, these Eastern farmers are quite different, much more different from the Westerners than the Westerners are from each other. In fact, if you look at pairwise FST, which is the proportion of variance that is between the groups, not within the groups, Eastern farmers to Western farmers is about 0.1. It's about the same as between Han Chinese and Northern Europeans today. So the people that were shifting to agriculture were very, very genetically distinct from each other during this early phase, right after the end of the Ice Age, very early in the Holocene, during the early Neolithic. That's basically saying that the spread of agriculture in the Near East was a function of cultural diffusion. It wasn't the movement of people, and there was no movement of pots at the time because of pre-pottery Neolithic, but it was a movement of ideas. I think that the spread of agriculture was easy, and the Natufians didn't overwhelm everybody else for two reasons. One, Natufians were still getting getting a hang of agriculture, so the comparative advantage that they had over their foraging neighbors was probably not that high. But the other issue is that all of the other foragers of the area had access to the same sort of cultural toolkit as the Natufians. This is the Near East. They had the same domestic animals, the same wild or potential domestic animals. They had the same wild animals in the area, many of the same grains in the area, et cetera, et cetera. So they probably did engage in some sort of semi-domestication, in my opinion, earlier, probably during the late Ice Age. And so it was really easy to pick up the agricultural lifestyle because they had already gone part of the way there, just like the Natufians. This is different elsewhere, where the cultural toolkit, the crops, everything, they're totally alien, they're imported, and they've been really perfected. Like, for example, the development of pots is a big deal, but presumably the varieties of wheat and barley are getting better, et cetera, et cetera. So it was different elsewhere. And that's the second thing I'm going to get to now. So in the early 2000s, there was a lot of argument whether the people in Europe who started farming, whether they were indigenous hunter-gatherers or descendants of Pleistocene Ice Age people, or whether they were from the Middle East. And the earliest genetic data indicated that most of the ancestry in Europe was probably not from the Middle East, and it was indigenous. So the argument was like, well, these are hunter-gatherers, and they, learned agriculture, and agriculture spread. So it starts spreading at like 7,000 BC, a little earlier probably, into Greece, last I remember. And, it gets to Scandinavia by about 4,500, no, not 4,500, 5,500. So like 3,500 BC, maybe 4,000 at the earliest. So it takes 3,000 years to get across Europe. And these people make it all the way also to Eastern Europe. So, for example, the last Neolithic culture in Poland, before the arrival of Indo-Europeans, corded ware are globular amphora, and they descend from these, this like diaspora of sorts, right? But like, is it genetic or is it cultural? At the time, comparing modern populations, it looked like modern Europeans were just too distinct from people in modern Anatolia for it to have been genetic. That was wrong. It turns out there's a lot of migration, and so you can't use modern populations ignorantly. That's the way I'm going to say it. I'm not saying it pejoratively, but you can't use it ignorantly with modern populations. You got to use ancient DNA. What ancient DNA found is two things, two primary things. The people in ancient Anatolia were genetically quite different, although not totally different from modern Anatolia. So your reference population in Anatolia has shifted, right? The second issue is the people in Europe themselves have transformed, okay? So ancient farming Europeans were totally overwhelmed in Northern Europe and somewhat overwhelmed in Southern Europe by Indo-Europeans from the steppe. And so when you're comparing modern Europeans to modern Middle Easterners, these are two populations that have both undergone radical transformations since the time period that you're actually trying to explore, okay? Because you're trying to explore the Neolithic, as early as 10,000 years ago, but, as late as 5,000 years ago. But everything has changed since then. So obviously the inferences made with modern populations didn't work. What do we know now? What we know now is that the early European farmers were Anatolians, okay? They're Anatolian farmers. The Anatolian farmers are directly descended from Anatolian foragers of the late Pleistocene. So early European farmers descend from Anatolian foragers, okay? And they're very genetically distinct from the indigenous hunter-gatherers, who just, it's like night and day, okay? So again, the genetic difference between the Anatolian farmers and the indigenous European hunter-gatherers is similar to, again, Han Chinese to Northern European, right? It's 0.1 around there. It's actually a little higher because the comparisons that are being used often are descendants of Anatolian farmers in Germany with the local people, and they're already about 20% Western hunter-gatherer, which is the population in Europe that they're looking at. So as the Anatolian farmers expanded, they obviously did mix with the local people. So, even as early in the Balkans, they're mixing with Balkan people. And so one push goes into Central Europe. They become the linear beaker, or not, LBK. So they're not, I don't think they're linear beaker, but they're LBK. The German is like linear Bacher or something. I don't know what it's about. So they become the LBK and the first farmers of Germany. And off the top of my head, they're about 75% or so Anatolian farmer, okay? In the Mediterranean, you have a different group that eventually become the Cardium pottery culture, Cardium ware culture. And they moved from Anatolia to Greece. Then it seems like they hopped to Italy, and from Italy, they hopped to southern France and southern Spain, Andalusia, Valencia, that area. So this looks like mostly a seaborne migration. I think that they were probably scouting ahead for fertile coastal areas. And so they're expanding across the Mediterranean. It takes them about 1,000 years max, I think, to get from Anatolia to Spain. In Northern Europe, it's a little bit more difficult. And this is because, Jared Diamond-esque insight, you're going across latitudes, not just longitudes. And so the climate is changing. So wheat and barley don't do nearly as well in the moist Northern European climates as they do in the Mediterranean, because the Mediterranean climate is much more similar to the Eastern Mediterranean, which is they're from, right? So southern Spain has a climate much more like Syria than Germany, or at the extreme case, Scandinavia. And so I think one reason that these farmers demographically swept over the native people is that they had a very well adapted cultural toolkit that's not easy to just learn from. You don't just, you try to go be a farmer in a month and it's going to be hard. There's all sorts of things even if you don't want to do mechanization, you want to just do subsistence, it's not that easy, right? You're going to end up supplementing by going to the supermarket and stuff, because you're not going to be able to do it all. There's a lot of learning, there's a lot of wisdom, there's a lot of culturally embedded information. And so I think that's what was happening. Now, they do mix with the native people, but the majority of the ancestry of these populations remains Anatolian farmer. So let's say about 3000 BC, 5,000 years ago, the population in Poland was mostly Anatolian farmer. The population in Sweden was mostly Anatolian farmer. The people that were building Stonehenge, mostly Anatolian farmer. People in Spain, Anatolian farmer. Everywhere, Anatolian farmer. Sardinia, Anatolian farmer. The whole European continent, really to the west of modern-day Ukraine and Belarus, was Anatolian farmer. So this was the empire of Anatolian farmers, and they were very genetically distinct from the Levantine farmers and the Eastern farmers. Now, in Anatolia, something different was going on. By the time we have Çatalhöyük, which is the world's biggest city for about 1,000 years in south-central Turkey, you guys can Google it. I think most of you know what Çatalhöyük is. I mean, I'm going to call it the first mega city in the history of the world. Jericho is the first city in modern-day Israel-Palestine, right? Jericho is the first city, and it's the oldest continuous city, but it's probably the first city. There might have been other first cities that we haven't discovered, but probably Jericho is one of the first. Çatalhöyük is a little later, but it's the biggest for 1,000 years. It was about 10,000 people, maybe a little bit more. That's London's population in the year 1000 AD. Obviously, London was bigger during the Roman period, and later on in the late medieval period. The point was, Çatalhöyük was a pretty big city over the course of human history, even though 10,000 doesn't seem like that much to us. Okay, but 10,000 people, you're starting to get anonymity. And probably a lot of the problems that you have with regular cities. Now, if you read about Çatalhöyük, you'll see it's very anarchic. It doesn't even seem like there were really streets, all sorts of weird things. They're really trying to figure stuff out. It rose and it fell and it collapsed in 1,000 years. I think this prefigures the rise and fall of civilizations, polities. A lot of new stuff is happening, right, in south-central Turkey, south-central Anatolia at this time. But these people already, at the beginning of Çatalhöyük, so that's about 9,000 BC, they're starting to be genetically distinct from the early European farmers, from the early Anatolian farmers. And the way they're being genetically distinct is there is a lot of Eastern farmer migration, perhaps from the Caucasus as well, that's coming into this area. And reciprocally, Anatolian farmer ancestry is also going eastward, into Western Iran and whatnot. So the genetic distance that was 0.1 is declining really fast. There's also some Levantine farmer ancestry that is going into Anatolia at this time from the south, and vice versa. So all these three Middle Eastern populations of days of yore, of the early Neolithic, are mixing, and they're creating a new kind of Middle Eastern population that's genetically distinct, and there's variation, but now it's more clinal, it's more gradual, and all the distances are smaller. By about 3000 BC, you have a situation in Anatolia where it's about roughly 40% early Anatolian farmer, let's just call it Anatolian farmer, about 40% Eastern farmer, so this is from the Zagros, Western Iran, Caucasus area, and then about 20% Levantine farmer. And if you go in the Levant, you'll see the same sort of thing. In fact, the Levantine proportion crashes linearly for a really long time. That's outside the purview of this talk, but I just want to mention that. And of course, in Iran, you also see the increase of Anatolian and Levantine. But in all of these areas, actually outside the Levant, because in the northern Levant, it's majority not Levantine, actually, soon enough. But in Anatolia and Iran, the local ancestry does still hold parity. It's still substantial. So 40% of the ancestry in Anatolia, 3000 BC, is the same ancestry that's descended from the original foragers, and then 60% are newcomers from other parts of the Middle East, right? And so what you see by the time you have Sumer, by the time you have writing, is the Middle East has been reconfigured, people have mixed together, and you have kind of this gradation and variation within the same sort of types. In Europe, there's far less Eastern farmer or Levant farmer there. Okay. Some of the Levant people, some of the Natufians, post-Natufians, did actually make it to Greece. There's a site, a cave in southern Greece, where the 100% Natufian type farmer very early on, but it looks like that didn't really take, and they were overwhelmed by Anatolian farmers. Okay, and so when you go to Sardinia, where you have a lot of this Anatolian farmer ancestry, they look very different than Middle Easterners because they don't have very much Eastern farmer or Levant ancestry. They look to a great extent, except for later Indo-European and lesser extent Roman era stuff. They look a lot like the early European farmers, and that population in 100% whatever does not exist anywhere else in the world. In Anatolia, Anatolian farmer does not exist 100%. That whole world is gone, right? The world of 3000 BC in Europe is gone. It was long gone in Anatolia. By Anatolia, it was, by 3000 BC, most of Europe had more of this, pre-pottery Neolithic Anatolian farmer. Actually, almost all of Europe. As I said, all of Europe, west of Russia, or west of Belarus, Russia, and the Ukraine, had much more Anatolian farmer than Anatolia did itself, because Anatolia was at 40%, and most of Europe was between 60 and 80%, I think, going off the top of my head. 60% in the north, because there was resurgence of Western hunter-gatherer, and in the south, I think it was 80%. There were some areas of the south, places like Sardinia, parts of Spain and Greece, where the fraction of Anatolian farmer was really close to 100% early on. Anyway, so we have a situation 3000 BC where the genetic characteristics of Anatolia are this way. They're 40, 40, 20, Anatolian farmer, Eastern farmer, and finally Levantine farmer. Okay. What happens afterwards? Well, it turns out that one of the things that the Reich Lab in particular has discovered is that Anatolia was genetically very, very stable between about 1000 AD and 3000 BC. 1000 AD is kind of like when the Turks start showing up. There's a battle of Manzikert, 1071. I think it was like Romanos IV, going off the top of my head, but Emperor Romanos IV, I think that was when he was defeated. Someone can direct message me and correct me. I mean, Google it. I just not going to touch my keyboard right now. And so the interior of Anatolia is opened up to the Seljuk Turks. I think they're specifically Oghuz tribal Turks. But for 4,000 years there, 4,000 years, there was actually a lot of genetic stability. This 40-40-20 mix was very dominant in the area. Now, there were other people. So if you read the Bible, Saul of Tarsus, he's Jewish. Maybe he's more Levantine. I don't know. And Greek language is spreading throughout Anatolia, but it looks like to be mostly a matter of cultural diffusion, not demographic diffusion. Those of you who want to read about the Greeks, read my Greek posts on Substack, and I think I've discovered there that Anatolian Greeks in particular, from certain areas, are very, very distinct from, quote, Greek Greeks, okay? But aside from that, there's Galatans in the Bible, there are Celts. There's all sorts of other random people that are coming into Anatolia, right? But it doesn't seem like they left a big impact. They left some, but not a big impact, right? And we know that there are some Slavic tribes that were settled in Anatolia, but again, they didn't seem to leave a big impact. And so Anatolia is really, really stable genetically for these 3,000 years. Another interesting fact is, there's been a lot of work on Roman Empire, and it turns out the cities in the Western Mediterranean, in particular Rome, were genetically very different during the imperial period. So Juvenal, the poet Juvenal, liked to say that the waters of the Tiber have, mixed in and been overwhelmed by the Orontes, which is basically, it's in Syria. And even though there were a lot of Greek speakers in Rome, most of those were probably, according to Juvenal, not Greek, but Syrians and other Eastern Mediterraneans. Well, recent work with the Anatolian data sets, it shows really clearly that a lot of these Eastern Mediterranean Romans were Anatolian, right? So they're very different from Republican Romans, Republican era Romans. So, before Augustus Caesar, before about 0 AD, they're more like, those people are like Italians. And then after the empire falls, 476 AD, really during the Gothic Wars of the 6th century, when the East Romans, the Byzantines, showed up, the city seems to have collapsed in population, going from say 500,000 to 50,000 or less. Modern Rome, at least before whatever recent stuff, It was actually repopulated from the Italian hinterland. And all of these eastern people from Anatolia to a great extent, but not all Anatolian, um, seem to have just like disappeared. And I think that's because of the demographic collapse that usually happens in cities. Pre-modern cities were dirty, et cetera, et cetera. People died, and they were always replenished from other areas. And when the Western Empire collapsed, they were not replenished anymore. Thank you for listening. To hear the rest of the monologue, please go to razib.substack.com and subscribe.
This podcast for kids.